Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at some pretty powerful forces in our world.
Oh, yeah.
Political ideologies.
Huge.
Yeah, these are systems of thought, really, that have shaped how we live and govern ourselves. I mean, they fueled revolutions,
Revolutions will
altered governments, and they continue to influence our lives in some pretty profound ways.
Absolutely. Still with us today.
And specifically today, we're going to be unraveling three of the most influential ideologies out there.
Oh, okay. Let's hear them.
Liberalism, conservatism, and socialism.
Big ones.
And get this, they all trace back to a time of just incredible intellectual upheaval,
Oh, really?
the Age of Enlightenment.
Enlightenment. Yeah, fascinating period. So what makes the Enlightenment so fascinating is that it was this time when thinkers really dared to challenge the very foundations of power.
I mean, it was a completely different world back then, right?
They questioned monarchies, they scrutinized religious dogma,
Wow.
and really reimagined how society could function.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's kind of hard to grasp how radical those ideas were back then.
It is.
I mean, imagine challenging the divine right of kings.
Oh, yeah.
It was complete upheaval of the established order.
Absolutely. A key figure to think about here is John Locke
Okay, John Locke.
and his groundbreaking concept of natural rights.
Natural rights.
This idea that individuals have inherent rights to life, liberty, and property.
Okay, so this idea that these rights weren't granted by a king or a government,
No, they were inherent.
they just existed.
Exactly. And this laid the groundwork for a whole new way of thinking about individual freedom and the role of government.
It was a game changer, really.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it planted the seeds for so many movements demanding individual liberties and challenging oppressive systems all over the world.
It did.
But Locke, he wasn't alone, was he?
No, not at all. We can't forget Jean-Jacques Rousseau,
Oh yeah, Rousseau.
another giant of the Enlightenment.
Huge.
Introduced the idea of the social contract.
Oh, the social contract, I've heard of that.
Yeah, arguing that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed.
So not from some divine mandate or hereditary, right?
No, from the people.
Wow. And that concept had a seismic impact, right?
It really did influencing revolutions and democratic movements across the globe.
It's still a cornerstone of democratic thought today.
Absolutely.
It's just amazing how these ideas, born centuries ago, continue to shape our world today, you know?
It is.
It makes you realize how powerful ideas really can be.
Ideas matter.
They do.
Yeah.
And speaking of powerful ideas, let's dive into the first of our three ideologies today, liberalism.
Okay, liberalism.
So how did this ideology emerge on the scene?
Well, liberalism really emerged as a response to the rigid and often oppressive power structures of the past.
You're talking about like monarchies and stuff.
Exactly. Think about the stifling control of monarchies and those deeply entrenched social hierarchies that limited individual opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very different world.
It was, and liberalism championed individual freedom, advocating for equality under the law and the protection of individual rights.
So essentially empowering individuals to make their own choices,
Yes,
pursue their own paths, and shape their own destiny.
precisely.
I love it. And who was a pivotal figure in shaping this liberal thought?
We have to talk about Adam Smith.
Okay, Adam Smith.
His groundbreaking work, The Wealth of Nations, laid out these principles of free markets
Free markets.
and limited government intervention.
Right.
These ideas formed the bedrock of modern capitalism and liberal democracies.
Adam Smith, the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly.
I remember studying his ideas in Econ 101.
Yeah, classic.
But how did those economic theories translate into real-world political change?
Well, let's consider the American Revolution.
Okay, the American Revolution.
The Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, was deeply influenced by Locke's ideas of natural rights.
Right. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly. And government by consent.
Powerful stuff.
It's a prime example of how liberalism, with its emphasis on individual liberty, ignited a movement for self-determination and democratic governance.
So those ideas from Locke, they really crossed the Atlantic
They did.
and fueled the American Revolution.
Absolutely.
And then just a few years later, you had the French Revolution erupting in 1789,
Oh, yeah.
embracing the values of liberté, égalité, fraternité,
Powerful.
liberty, equality, and fraternity. For those who haven't brushed up on their French Revolution history,
Right.
talk about liberalism shaking things up.
Definitely. So the French Revolution, although far more radical and tumultuous than the American Revolution, further underscores how potent those ideas of liberalism were. anymore.
Yeah, it really shows how these ideas were spreading.
Yes.
It wasn't just confined to America and France.
Not at all. Liberalism became a global force influencing the development of democratic systems worldwide.
So these core principles that we still see today.
Absolutely. The emphasis on free speech, human rights, and the rule of law, these are all cornerstones of the liberal tradition.
It's fascinating how an ideology born out of the Enlightenment could have such a lasting impact on the world.
It is.
But while liberalism championed individual freedom, it also faced pushback, right?
Of course.
I mean, not everyone embraced this idea of rapid change and individual liberty.
Absolutely. And that's where our next ideology comes in.
Okay.
Conservatism.
Yeah, conservatism.
It emerged in many ways as a response to what some saw as the excesses and potential dangers of unbridled individual liberty and rapid societal change.
So a bit of a counter movement.
In a way,
So
yeah.
if liberalism was all about embracing change and individual freedom,
Yeah.
conservatism was more about tapping the brakes a little bit.
In a way, yeah. I mean, if you think about the historical context, conservatism arose as a reaction to that whirlwind of change brought about by events like the French Revolution.
It makes sense.
Yeah, many saw those upheavals as destabilizing and dangerous.
Yeah, too much change too fast.
Right, advocating for a more cautious approach to societal transformation.
Makes sense. And was there a key figure who really kind of embodied this conservative philosophy?
Yeah, Edmund Burke is considered like a cornerstone of conservative thought.
Edmund Burke,
His work, Reflections on the Revolution in France,
long title.
it was a powerful critique of the revolution's radicalism.
Interesting.
Burke argued that societies are intricate tapestries woven over generations,
I like that analogy.
and that abrupt revolutionary change could unravel this delicate fabric, leading to chaos and tyranny.
So instead of tearing down the entire system,
Right?
Burke and other conservatives believed in kind of preserving what worked,
Yeah.
adapting gradually, respecting the wisdom embedded in long-standing institutions.
Exactly. They saw institutions like the monarchy, the church, and social hierarchies
Okay.
not as oppressive remnants of the past, but as vital pillars of social order.
Interesting.
They argued that these institutions provided stability, continuity, and a sense of shared identity.
It's such a different way of looking at things than the liberal perspective,
It is.
right? Liberalism champions the individual progress, sometimes even radical change,
Yeah.
while conservatism emphasizes the collective tradition and a more cautious approach to change.
Yeah, that's a key insight. It's not about one being right and the other being wrong.
Right?
There are different lenses through which to view the world and the role of the individual in society, the pace of change, and the role of governing institutions.
Okay, so different perspectives on some pretty fundamental questions.
Exactly.
So how did this conservative perspective translate into the political landscape?
Well,
Did it shape governments and movements in a different way than liberalism did?
absolutely. Conservatism played a significant role in maintaining monarchies in certain parts of Europe
Okay.
and in shaping conservative political parties.
So the parties we see today.
Yeah, think about parties that emphasize limited government, fiscal responsibility, traditional family values, and a strong national defense.
Okay.
These are all themes that resonate with the core principles of conservatism.
Yeah, you can definitely see those themes in conservative parties around the world.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these two seemingly opposing ideologies,
Right.
liberalism and conservatism, emerged from the same period of intellectual upheaval and continue to shape political discourse even today.
It's true.
But there was a third ideology that entered the scene, wasn't there?
Yeah.
One that offered a very different vision of how society could be structured. Socialism.
Socialism.
So while liberalism and conservatism were kind of duking it out,
Yeah.
socialism emerged as a critique of both systems,
It did.
offering a different diagnosis of the ills of the time.
Yeah, and remember, this was the era of industrialization with its often brutal working conditions, burgeoning factories, and a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots.
A lot of social upheaval.
Right.
Yeah, so if liberalism championed individual freedom in the political sphere,
Yeah.
and conservatism was wary of radical change, socialism was primarily concerned with economic justice.
Precisely. Socialism viewed both liberalism and conservatism as perpetuating a system that inherently favored the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the working class.
Okay, so a very different focus.
It was, and socialists argued for a more equitable distribution of wealth, collective ownership of resources, and a strong role for the state in ensuring social welfare and economic equality.
So a much more active role for the government and the economy.
Right.
Okay, so less about individual freedom, more about collective well-being.
In a way.
And the big names here are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, correct?
Of course.
Their Communist Manifesto really shook things up.
It did. Marx and Engels provided a scathing critique of capitalism.
A bold statement.
They argued that it created a system of exploitation where the working class or the proletariat was alienated from their labor and forced to sell their labor power to the capitalists or the bourgeoisie who own the means of production.
So Marx is saying that the very structure of capitalism creates this inherent conflict between the workers and the owners.
Exactly, and he predicted that this conflict would inevitably lead to revolution, resulting in the overthrow of the capitalist system and the establishment of a classless society where resources and the means of production would be collectively owned and controlled.
Wow, a pretty radical vision.
It was, and it's important to note that socialism, like liberalism and conservatism, didn't remain a monolithic ideology.
Okay.
It branched out, evolving into different forms.
Right, we have democratic socialism, which aims to achieve socialist goals through democratic means, like elections and reforms, rather than through violent revolution.
Right.
And then there's communism, which takes a more revolutionary approach, often advocating for the forceful overthrow of the capitalist state.
Exactly. And in the 20th century, we saw these different strands of socialist thought play out on the world stage.
So like real-world examples of these ideologies in action.
Yes. Think about the Soviet Union, China, Cuba.
Big players.
These nations adopted Marxist-Leninist ideologies, leading to the creation of communist states with varying degrees of success and, of course, considerable controversy.
Right. Those communist states often struggled with the very issues of individual liberty and economic efficiency that they were trying to address.
That's true. They often ended up replacing one form of inequality and oppression with another. A cautionary tale, perhaps?
Yeah. But despite the shortcomings of these historical experiments, it's crucial to recognize that socialist ideas continue to resonate, especially in the face of ongoing challenges like income inequality, lack of access to affordable healthcare and education, and concerns about the environmental impact of unfettered capitalism.
So those core socialist concerns about economic justice and the need for a fairer system haven't gone away.
Not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they seem to be gaining renewed traction, especially as we grapple with issues like the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few remnants, the precariousness of the gig economy, and the growing anxieties about automation and its potential impact on jobs.
So even though the Soviet Union is gone, the Berlin Wall has fallen, and China has embraced a form of state capitalism.
Those socialist critiques of inequality and the need for a more equitable system are still relevant today.
Absolutely. They're part of the ongoing conversation about how we structure our economies, how we distribute resources, and how we ensure that everyone has a fair shot at a decent life.
So it's fascinating to see how these ideologies we've been unpacking, liberalism, conservatism, and socialism, they aren't just stuck in the past.
No.
They're very much alive and kicking.
They are.
Constantly adapting to like the whirlwind of changes in our 21st century world.
It's a new world.
It's like they're facing a whole new set of challenges.
Right.
In this era of globalization, technological leaps, and a looming climate crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, the very context in which these ideologies operate has shifted so dramatically.
Yeah.
They're being forced to grapple with issues that the thinkers who first articulated them could scarcely have imagined.
Yeah, so let's start with liberalism.
Okay.
It's always been about individual freedom and progress.
Right.
But what are like some of the major hurdles it's facing today?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the stark reality of economic inequality.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
While liberalism champions free markets and individual initiative, the unfettered capitalism of recent decades has led to a widening gap between the super rich and everyone else.
It feels like that gap is growing wider by the day,
It is.
both within countries and globally.
Absolutely.
It's making people question whether the traditional liberal solutions are really enough to create a truly fair and just society.
Right. Some argue that we need a more robust social safety net, stronger regulations to rein in corporate power,
Yeah,
and maybe even a rethinking of the very nature of work in this age of automation.
that's interesting.
It's a debate that's happening within liberalism itself. How to balance individual liberty with the need for greater social and economic justice.
Yeah, it's like this age-old tension, right?
Yes.
Between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
Yeah.
If you champion individual freedom, above all else, does that sometimes come at the expense of the common good?
It's a question that liberals are wrestling with today.
For sure.
And then there's the rise of nationalism and populism.
Oh yeah, those are big ones.
Movements that often clash with the globalist cosmopolitan outlook, often associated with liberalism.
Yeah, you see these movements gaining ground all over the world.
It's true.
They appeal to a sense of national identity and sovereignty.
Right.
Sometimes using rhetoric that excludes or demonizes certain groups.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma for liberals who believe in universal human rights, the importance of international cooperation,
Right.
and the value of diversity and inclusion. How do you defend those values in the face of movements that often seem hostile to them?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like liberalism is at a crossroads.
It is.
It has to figure out how to adapt to these new challenges while staying true to its core principles.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it risks becoming irrelevant in a world that's rapidly changing.
that's a very perceptive observation. And it's not just liberalism that's facing these kinds of questions.
Oh, really?
Conservatism is also grappling with how to navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
Okay, so if liberalism is struggling to balance individual freedom with collective well-being,
Right.
what are some of the key tensions within conservatism today?
Well, one of the central challenges for conservatism is how to reconcile its emphasis on tradition and stability with the dizzying pace of social and technological change.
Right, how do you hold on to tradition when everything around you is changing so fast?
Exactly, and some conservative values, particularly those related to the social issues, might appear out of step with evolving societal norms.
Yeah, you see this in the debates around LGBTQ+, for example,
Right.
or the changing roles of women in society.
Exactly.
Some conservatives are embracing these changes while others hold firmly to traditional beliefs,
Right.
even when those beliefs are increasingly at odds with the direction society is moving.
It's a real tension.
It's,
And then there's technology.
oh yeah, technology is a game changer.
It is the digital revolution, social media, artificial intelligence. These are forces that are transforming our lives at an unprecedented rate.
For sure.
And they're raising these profound questions about privacy, security, the nature of work,
Yeah,
and even what it means to be human.
deep questions.
It's a lot for anyone to wrap their heads around, but for conservatives who value stability and continuity,
Yeah,
it can be especially disorienting.
I can imagine it's like trying to hold on to those traditional values and institutions when the world around you is changing so rapidly.
It is.
It's like trying to stand firm on shifting sand.
Exactly. So you have this tension within conservatism between those who want to hold fast to the past and those who are looking for ways to adapt conservative principles to the realities of the present, without losing sight of what they see as the enduring wisdom of those principles.
Yeah, it's like trying to find that balance.
It is.
So it's interesting how both liberalism and conservatism are grappling with these internal divides,
Right.
trying to figure out how to stay relevant and meaningful in a world that's vastly different from the one in which they originated.
Yeah.
But what about socialism? It seems to be having a bit of a moment,
It does.
especially among younger people.
Especially. Yeah.
Is it actually making a comeback?
Well, there's definitely a resurgence of interest in socialist ideas.
Okay.
Particularly in the face of widening inequality, environmental crises, and a growing sense that capitalism in its current form isn't serving the needs of many people.
Yeah, you see this in the rising popularity of figures like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who identify as democratic socialists and are advocating for policies like Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, and greater regulation of corporations.
Right, they're tapping into a vein of discontent,
Yeah.
a feeling that the system is rigged against ordinary people,
Right.
and that we need a more fundamental shift in how we organize our economy and our society.
But socialism also has its own baggage, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, those 20th century experiments with communism didn't exactly go as planned.
Right.
They often ended up being authoritarian regimes that suppressed individual liberties and stifled economic innovation.
That's true, and it's something that contemporary socialists have to grapple with.
Yeah.
They have to show that their vision of a more equitable and just society doesn't require sacrificing individual freedom
Right.
or falling into the traps of authoritarianism and economic inefficiency that plagued some of those earlier socialist regimes.
So it's not enough to just critique capitalism.
No.
They have to offer a compelling alternative, the model that can actually work in the real world.
Exactly. They have to address those historical concerns and show that a more democratic, decentralized, and humane form of socialism is possible.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But it seems like these debates about the future of socialism, like the debates within liberalism and conservatism,
right,
are essential conversations to have if we want to create a better future.
I agree. These aren't just abstract ideological debates happening in ivory towers. They have real-world consequences for how we address the most pressing challenges of our time. Absolutely.
From climate change to poverty to the rise of technological disruption.
It's like we're in this massive global laboratory.
It's a good way to put it.
Experimenting with different ideas and approaches to see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And understanding these underlying ideologies, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, gives us a framework for making sense of those experiments.
It's like having a set of lenses that help us see the world more clearly.
I love that.
To understand the motivations behind different political movements and policy decisions.
It's also a reminder that these ideologies aren't static.
Right.
They're constantly evolving, borrowing from each other, and being reshaped by new ideas and social movements.
That's right.
What we might call liberalism or conservatism or socialism today might look very different from what those terms meant a century ago or even a decade ago.
Very true.
And who knows what these ideologies will look like a century from now or even a decade from now.
Right. It's exciting and a bit daunting to think about.
The thing is, we're living in a time of tremendous change and uncertainty. We are.
And these ideological battles are just one part of a much larger story about how we navigate this complex and ever-evolving world.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the origins of these ideologies to the challenges they're facing today. What's the big takeaway you'd like our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is to be critical thinkers.
Okay.
Don't just accept these ideologies at face value. Engage with them, question them, challenge them, and see how they can be applied or maybe even reimagined to address the issues we face today.
It's about recognizing that these ideologies are tools.
They are.
And like any tool, they can be used for good or for ill.
Right.
It's up to us to use them wisely, thoughtfully, and with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Couldn't agree more. And don't be afraid to think outside the traditional ideological boxes.
Okay.
The world is too complex, too interconnected to be neatly categorized into rigid ideological camps.
It's messy.
It is. We need to be open to new ideas, new solutions, and new ways of thinking about the challenges and opportunities ahead.
Well said. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of political ideologies. We hope it's given you some new insights and inspired you to continue exploring these complex and ever-relevant ideas.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the deep dive never truly ends.
Words to live by.
There's always more to learn, more to question, and more to discover.